Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real honor of mine to be chatting tonight with Anne Golden. Anne Golden is probably one of those individuals that knows Toronto and the greater regional metropolitan area of Toronto better than anyone, and has written about it, studied it, and suggested policy alternatives for it over the course of several decades. And so I think it's an incredible opportunity for all of us to hear what she's got to say, but it's a real honor for me because I've been following her career and some of the things she said very intently for a while. And it's a real pleasure. Anne Golden has a BA in history from the University of Toronto. She's got an MA from Columbia University and has a PhD in American history from the University of Toronto. She was with the Greater Toronto United Way for numerous years. She was the president and CEO of the Conference Board of Canada. She was named a distinguished visiting scholar at Ryerson University. And of big importance to me is that she was appointed to be chair of the Greater Toronto Area Task Force in 1996 and put forward really, I think, one of the most forward-thinking reports about what Toronto should all be like in the future. And so, Anne Golden, it's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm very honored to be here.
I'm honored to have you. But let me ask you, I interviewed Joe Barrich, who's head of urban strategies, and he said, Brian, no one in Toronto, no politician, no premier, nobody is thinking about where Toronto is and is going in the future. That Toronto is the fourth largest city in North America after Mexico, New York, Los Angeles. It's going to be, getting close to probably 10 million people in the next bunch of years if you go from Oshawa to St. Catharines or Niagara Falls and Kitchener-Waterloo, when you define a centrist metropolitan area as contiguous, urban development. It's the growth engine from an economic industrial standpoint of Canada, and we're fragmented. We're not coordinated. We're thinking about separation rather than consolidation. We're not acting like the region that we could and should be. What do you think of that kind of a criticism?
Oh, he's absolutely right. And interestingly, when I was asked to do the report for Bob Rae, then Premier, it was Joe Barrich who developed the terms of reference. And he and I were on the same page at that time. At that time also, this was the 1990s. And there were new understanding of the role of cities in the world economy were just emerging. The whole concept of the importance of city-states. Neil Pierce wrote a very important book about that city-states, arguing that city-states were the engines of nations, and that's where the real economic power would be for the future. And basically talked about the importance of a regional understanding in order to be able to coordinate the planning for services, in order to stop the economic competition that was hurting the individual cities, and in order to create a political system that provided local democracy and accountability with the coordination. I believe very much in the results of our task force. It was a huge participation exercise. We had submissions from all over the region, and we put a tremendous amount of effort into it, even though we were supposed to have about a year and a half to do it. And then it ended up after Bob Rae was defeated by Mr. Harris, we were shortened to 4 months. And we gave a momentary consideration to not continuing, but the task force and I felt it was so important to address the issues, not just property tax, which at that time was considered to be broken, but also to address the issue of planning and development and how we coordinate infrastructure planning, what we do about local democracy, and how we create regional democracy. So we did work hard, unbelievably hard, and produce a report that I think stands the test to today. Yes, we don't have the metropolitan mindset that we need, and as a result, I'm not optimistic about where we're headed.
So why don't we have that metropolitan mindset, and what would you do to change it?
Well, how long do we have, Brian?
As long as you want.
We don't have the metropolitan mindset. Let's just address the structural issue. People understand the history of Toronto, that originally we were 13 municipalities when Metropolitan Toronto was created in 1954. And at that point, there were 13 municipalities. The province chose a chairman. I think it was Fred Gardner was our first chairman. And after that, the Metropolitan Council would elect the chairman. In 1964, Carl Goldenberg wrote a report, and the number of municipalities went from 13 to 6. And probably the next big change, well, then in the 1960s, John Robarts was our premier. And he launched a study, 3 studies really, that were integrated on the economy and planning and future of the region, on what they called then the Toronto-centered region, what we now call the GTA. They took the best planners, the best minds in Ontario, and spent 10 years thinking about all these issues. They were concerned about sprawl. They were concerned about the environmental impacts of how we were building and developing randomly, not in a form that could be supported by public services. They were concerned about the fact that our infrastructure was based on a certain vision of where Toronto was going, but in fact, people were moving west, and what was going to happen to cities in the east and south in Ontario. So many things were off track. And he did 10 years worth of studies. At that time, I was young. And one of the first things I did was an evaluation of design for development. And I showed basically that it was being ignored. This takes us back to the 60s. So the first reason that we're in trouble is that we never paid attention, even 40, 50 years ago, when we understood that our plan for development was not accurate. We did not pay attention to what the evidence showed, I would say. That was those studies. So Premier Ray asked me to head up a task force, and brilliant people were on the task force, including Jack Diamond, who passed away recently, Rob Pritchard, Joseph Wong, and Tom McCormick, an economist from Mississauga. And we produced this report that I do think had the right answer, and that was to create a regional council for those 3 broad functions that cannot be done locally. So think about the environment and ecosystems. They don't have borders. Their borders don't align with our little municipal borders. And we all understand that. So we need to have some coordination at the environmental, at the regional level for environment. There's a long answer to this because right now there's a new bill 197 that's going to remove the power of local municipalities to have input into environmental decisions. And David Crombie did it, and I did not an op-ed by David Crombie and me appeared in the Toronto Star this week on that topic. But going back to the structural issues, so we did this report, and we recommended a regional council that would have broad jurisdiction over environmental, over police matters, because boundaries don't count with police issues, and broad infrastructure planning issues. We would strengthen the local municipalities. We never did decide on how many cities. There were about 31, I think, municipalities in the region at that time. But personally, I favored and talked about 4 cities rather than 6. It had been changed to 6 by Carl Goldenberg in 1964. The reason I favored 4 was because 2 of the 6 cities, York and East York, did not have the tax base to support the services they needed to deliver. So by adding them to Toronto and keeping Scarborough, North York, and Etobicoke, we would accomplish the purpose of creating 4 cities that had sufficient tax base to work, but could work together also as needed. After we did our report, which I actually thought was going to be accepted, and then it wasn't accepted. And as you know, the premier then came out recommending a megacity. If I had to focus on the one reason why Toronto is not working today, it would be the creation of the megacity. It was a big mistake and remains a big mistake. It's eviscerated the meaning of local government. It's both too big and too small. It's too small because it doesn't address the whole region, which is the key underlying fundamental policy issue. And it's too big because there's no real local democracy, particularly after the premier in 2018, in the middle of the election, cut Metropolitan Council in half, leaving the city with constituencies or jurisdictions, each councillor twice as large as, 3 times as large, 4 times as large as many of the local government jurisdictions across the country.
So amalgamation, and then second of all, the reduction in the number of city councillors was a big mistake in your mind.
Well, that definitely was a big mistake. But on the broad issue you're asking in terms of where's Toronto going in, and going back to the Joe Barrett quote, the reason megacity was a stumbling block. It was not anything that helped the vision of creating a capacity to work cooperatively, collaboratively across the metropolitan area while still preserving local democracy.
This is going to be a fascinating conversation tonight, everyone, with Ann Golden, who probably knows, as I said, more about governance in the Greater Toronto Area than anyone I know. Was the chairman of a GTA task force just a few years ago in 1996. And as she mentioned, wrote a really interesting op-ed with former mayor of Toronto, David Crombie, just this past week about some mistakes that she thinks that we're making in Ontario today. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Ann Golden. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Ann Golden. She is a incredibly knowledgeable person about what's going on, frankly, in the world in city planning, but particularly in regards to the Greater Toronto Area. As I mentioned previously, she was with the United Way of Greater Toronto for quite a bit of time. From 2001 to 2012, she was the president and CEO of the Conference Board of Canada. She's been a visiting scholar at Ryerson University. And importantly, in 1996, she was the chairman of the Greater Toronto Area Task Force. Ms. Golden, thank you so much for joining us. I've got to ask you about a couple of the things that you just mentioned, if I could. You said that the reduction in the number of councillors in the Toronto Council was a mistake. We talked about Joe Barrett. Joe Barrett said the biggest problem with development in a show that I did with him was that the councillors ended up being sort of lords of their own local fiefdoms and traded horses, traded with local developers to get the kind of developments that they want. They were overly influenced by NIMBYism in the area and by the people that were the loudest critics, which tended to be anti-development because of low turnouts in elections. Those loudest critics ended up being very influential to a politician that wanted to have re-election opportunities, and that because of that, we ended up having a dysfunctional council. And he also went on to say, and other councillors will very rarely disagree with the home councillor and what they want to do because they don't want that councillor to meddle in their areas. And he said governance is the problem. And he argued that we actually shouldn't have local councillors. We should elect councillors at large for the whole city, that the only one person that was actually thinking about the whole city was the mayor. So he actually almost went the opposite direction of you in his argument that local representation was the problem, not the solution. What do you say to that, ma'am?
Joe and I don't agree on this issue. Democracy is messy, hard. The challenge with Toronto governance is the size of the council, the fact that it represents several million, it's too big in terms of, so right now, the only way you can get through an agenda, and the agendas are huge. Yes, there is that log rolling that you support what I want in my area, and I'll support what you want. Definitely, there are problems, and it's not a perfect system. But, like Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst of all systems except for every other one. I'm not opposed to all NIMBY. There was a quote attributed to Aristotle, which I've actually tried to look up and can't find. But the quote that I read in a report that somebody put in was, the person who's wearing the shoe can best tell where it pinches. I think it's apocryphal because in Aristotle's day, they wore sandals. But I think the point is true, that it is important that people have some place where they can say what matters to them. It's always balanced by, in my solution, there would have been a regional voice and other authorities, and there's other institutions that help to balance it. But I'm a great believer in the importance of local citizens engaging, expressing what's important to them. Let me give you an example, Brian. If you had no local ability to influence a decision, we would have the Spadina Expressway decision go the other way. you would have had the Spadina Expressway going through neighborhoods, the Forest Hill, the Annex, all the way through the city, eviscerating the neighborhoods. And really, I think the key to Toronto's success has been the fact that we have been able to retain our neighborhoods downtown where people live, work, and play. Expressways going through the city, if you go to any of the American cities, kill life in the cities. They don't add to it. That was just one of many, many decisions where local input really mattered. So I'm in favor of local input. I'm in favor of local democracy. But when you create an arena, like a Metropolitan Council, at that time it had 50 councillors, it was too big. So the answer was not, I'll tell you what the real answer was. The answer was not just to cut the councils in half so the size of the local ward is now, in some cases, 150,000 people, bigger than most cities in Canada with one person. But you don't have a regional process or structure to create a metropolitan mindset or a regional mindset and to solve regional problems. So you have the province of Ontario acting as the regional government for the Greater Toronto Area and making decisions that affect the local areas from too high a vantage point without the knowledge and experience and understanding to feel the full impact and talk about the impact of private developers having influence on a single point in the process. I think you know the story to that one, Brian.
So what's your solution for the whole region?
My regions, I go back to what I recommended in 1996. We should have had a regional, I don't know whether you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I don't know whether you could take the metropolitan government and create 4 cities and have it as part of a larger region where environmental issues, planning, infrastructure issues, economic areas of economic cooperation, broad issues that span the region could be discussed within a political framework that has accountability. Right now, we have a special purpose body, Metrolinx, which works very hard to give us a regional perspective for the GO and transit systems that they are developing, the Metrolinx system. But we don't have a second tier, a regional second tier. You know, when Metropolitan Toronto was created back in the 1960s, I think it was in the 1970s, I was at the Bureau of Municipal Research, and we had a worldwide conference on what is the best governance for metropolitan areas in Toronto, on the campus of the University of Toronto. And at that time, our metropolitan system of government was praised by the experts around the world as the jewel in the crown of metropolitan federations everywhere. And then we ended it with insufficient study going in the wrong direction. And it was a political decision, not a decision based on analysis and evidence. And I regret that that decision was taken. You asked about what is the future of Toronto. You know, I always like to think of myself as a very optimistic person. I'm only 5'2", so I said, you're short, you'll always see the glass half full. I will confess to you that I don't see the glass half full anymore. I see serious problems besetting Toronto, the growth in the social economic divide in terms of income and wealth disparity. I see that we don't have enough money to address the problems that we need to. I think that the structural and governance changes that we've made are resulting in what I consider the real enemy of the future of cities, sprawl. We're seeing attempts to promote sprawl. The recent bill that was to develop the Green Belt, which was blocked by local action, Brian, by local groups engaging, by the force of local people getting together. I should acknowledge that I'm with David Crombie, a co-founder of the Alliance for a Livable Ontario, and that's all about local engagement, all about thousands of people and hundreds of organizations working together to promote a more enlightened way of developing our region, one that does not hurt our environment, one that creates cities that are livable, walkable, one that creates the opportunity to build up more affordable housing. So it's the reasons that I'm not as positive is because we have huge problems and challenges besetting us, and we don't fully understand what the challenge of AI will mean, but we have huge challenges coming at us. We don't have either the fiscal or governance capacity to address them.
So let me challenge you, if I could, in that area. So in the last couple of years, I understand that 80% of all the condominium development has taken place within a kilometer of Union Station and or a major transit. And if you take a look at the sort of the representation of what the Toronto skyline is shaping up to be right now, and certainly will be once the currently proposed projects, we've got incredible densification in downtown Toronto. The Ontario line, which has been talked about, whether it's Downtown Relief Line or something like that, for decades, is actually under construction, which will actually probably take some of that development east and west from Union Station along Queen Street where it's going. And so, aren't we doing some of the things in regards to densification
It's the vision
that we need to do?
Those of us that talk about an alternative form of development with improved density are not talking about Yonge and Eglinton overdensity or downtown Toronto overdensity. We're talking about, I guess we would say, gentle density, moderate density, as Jane Jacobs proposed back in the 60s, that follow the transit lines. 4-story walk-ups, 6-story apartments, probably max, that support the public transit so that not everybody has to drive a car everywhere they go. It can't be afforded by most people, and it creates the kind of congestion that then makes life less livable and also creates economic problems, because if people can't, the cities will die if there's too much congestion. If they don't have alternative transit. So we're not talking about taking 2 or 3 points in a city and overbuilding those areas. If you look at the affordable housing problem, it's not just one problem. We don't build the kind of housing mix. There's middle-class people that want to buy certain kind of housing. There's poor people, Indigenous groups, all kinds of housing that's needed. Housing for people with mental illness. You didn't mention it, but I did do a report on how to solve homelessness for Mel Lastman. And we had a full section in there on what to do about housing. And part of the answer is how we develop. If we continue to sprawl, that is random development, very, very low density, very, very large homes, on our farmland, which we're still losing at close to 400 acres a day, but on our farmland, there's no way that can be accessed by people who don't have cars. There's no public transit that you can afford there. So we have to find a balance between density that's livable density. Europe has been the model for many, many years, and I've traveled a lot in the world, and they have that kind of density. Go to cities like, in particular, I'm thinking of Paris because I was there for a month. Cities are walkable, and you don't have uber concentration. The answer to sprawl is not building more around Union Station or building up Yonge and Eglinton.
So I was at the Toronto Region Board of Trade big dinner this past week, and the Premier was one of the main speakers, and he was bragging about 413 and the Bradford bypass, and the thought that those would be critically important infrastructure developments for the Greater Toronto Area. You disagree?
I'm not the expert on these roads, but I do listen a lot to the people who are opposed to them, both locally and broader. One of the points I hear them say is, we already have the 407. Yes, people don't use it because there's a toll, but why can't that be purchased and opened up? To me, and there are many people who are opposed to both of those roads. The cost of building those roads, I would say one thing that I do know is that as soon as you build an expressway, it gets filled up. It's never the answer to congestion. It's a momentary answer. So it's never the right way to go. You need some, but we have the 407, which is underutilized dramatically. So, and the people that I listen to have very, very good arguments for environmental and traffic arguments for not building these highways, and economic arguments.
Brent Todderin, the former chief planner from the city of Vancouver, recently used that quote that said, dealing with highway congestion by building a new highway is like treating obesity by increasing your belt size.
Actually, I hadn't heard that, and I think that's great.
I thought
That's
it was
exactly, you know what? That's a great quote. Can I borrow that quote?
anytime. So development, and the city of Toronto and the federal government is really enforcing upon a lot of cities across Canada this idea of as it right zoning that people can change a single family home into a fourplex. That sounds like the kind of gentle density that you're talking about. Many people call that sort of the missing middle, laneway housing and stuff like that. But other critics say that that's going to change the flavor of our neighborhoods, that people don't want to live with a rooming house next door, that maybe that along major arterials would be okay, but not everywhere in Toronto, even though that's what it's being forced upon us by the federal government to get infrastructure monies.
I'm sympathetic to both sides of the argument. I think when you buy a home, there's a zoning that you expect, that you enter into, in a sense, and understanding that that's the area where you are zoned a certain way. And there's economic consequences to the purchaser or to the owner if the zoning is dramatically changed, while you're there. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't studied the impact of fourplexes. I have lived in areas where duplexes are allowed, and I have not seen negative consequences of duplexes. Duplexes are not group homes. Group homes are a separate issue. But I guess my answer to that would be, you need local input on this decision, as well as the broader. Yes, we do need to open up some as of right zoning, but I think there probably are reasonable compromises in terms of where it can be done and how much it should be done. But I'd have to, just my nature, Brian, I have to understand actually the consequences of it and look at the research on it.
I had Jennifer Keesmaat, former chief planner for the city of Toronto, on my show, and she said that one of the biggest mistakes we made is not dramatically increasing the zoning along Bloor and Danforth when the Bloor Danforth subways were built, such that we didn't get the Yonge Street kind of development. And I don't think she was arguing for the Yonge and Eglinton kind of development that you criticized, but she certainly was suggesting that something more than the two-story commercial development that we have along much of Bloor and Danforth, it was wrong, and that we needed to be able to build that sort of 6 to 8 stories that you quoted in Paris and London and elsewhere in the world. So I do think that that's one of the solutions, is that along major arterials we've got to have greater density, and maybe not 50 stories, but certainly greater density. Some of that is happening, and you're getting that in the Golden Mile in Scarborough. You're getting it at 6 Points in Etobicoke. You're getting it near the Weston GO train station. So there is more development taking place, albeit, which I think is good, along major transit. Not everywhere, but along major transit.
Let me reinforce that point. When the Eglinton line was being considered, and that it was approved, then filled in, and then dug out again. It was unfortunate. And I was on Metrolinx board when we started the Metrolinx line along Eglinton. Eglinton is a perfect example. And I did read the business case, and I did the transit report for Premier Wynne, and I argued there the importance of having a business case for every one of these transit lines, be it LRT or subways, which are probably passé, but you need to have the business case. And the business case for the Eglinton line right now, in my view, or when I read it then, was not positive, because it is really underdeveloped. Drive along Eglinton going towards west of Kew. It's really underdeveloped. Jane Jacobs had suggested up to 6 stories, so that was the number that's stuck in my head, and because I can visualize it. I think once you get to 8 or 10 stories, it starts to look high-risey. And but I think that the first and obvious answer is increased development, reasonable development in consultation with local communities along transit lines. Yes.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Ann Golden and chat about the area around Toronto, not just the current city of Toronto, and what solutions she's got there. Stay with us, everyone. I'm enjoying this conversation immensely.
Thanks.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. One of those individuals that I've admired in Toronto more than anyone else is my guest tonight, Ann Golden. And I followed her reports. I haven't agreed with everything she said, but it's been fun to read her reports and her columns and hear what she's got to say. Ann was head of the United Way of Greater Toronto, head of the Conference Board of Canada. She's a scholar at Ryerson University, and she was chairman of the Greater Toronto Area Task Force in 1996, and the Toronto Homelessness Action Task Force, appointed by Mayor Lastman. One of the things that's been really topical in my area, Saga 960 is sort of Peel, west north Toronto area, is this controversy in regards to potential separation of Mississauga from Peel. And then the mayor of Brampton did a bunch of studies that showed that it would be, $1.5 billion worth of extra cost to do that separation. And so therefore, some people have talked about the amalgamation of Peel. The GTA task force looked at what should happen around the city of Toronto. And you mentioned that you created sort of a second tier. Today, what do you think the right solution is for Halton, Peel, York, Dufferin, etc.?
In terms of what it would cost, right now, I don't think they finished their work or they're close to finishing it. John Livy is analyzing what it would cost. John was my executive director on the GTA task force, I guess it was 25 years ago. And I did ask him would it work to take Peel out as a separate city. Remember, at the start of this conversation, I had envisaged the city of Toronto with 4 cities. And John and I did look at the possibility of Mississauga, because of its size, that, over 1 million people, being its own city. It wasn't a deep analysis that we did, but at the time, we didn't come out in favor of that. The answer to that, you've got Caledon, Brampton, and Mississauga, totally each one different. Brampton growing. Whether or not it needs, if you had the regional council that I had proposed, I think that would have answered some of the coordination issues. But I understand where Bonnie Crombie is coming from in trying to make the case for Mississauga to have its own city. I do not know, and I won't know until that report comes out, what will the impact be on Caledon tax base? What will the impact be on Brampton? And Brampton is changing quite a bit too. So I guess I would have to opt out of the answer, because I think that the decision-making is in flux, but I'd be interested to see what they find out.
So I had an interesting conversation with the former mayor of Mississauga, Hazel McCallion, at one point in time. And she referenced your report and some of the thinking, because I guess you must have consulted her at one point in time in that whole process. And she said that that if you took Mississauga, which is about 800,000, Brampton of about 500,000, Caledon of about 50,000, and you amalgamated it, you'd get over 1.3 million people, which would be the 3rd largest city in Canada. She said that's what should happen, but no one's got the political gumption. She actually used a different word, but the political gumption to make that happen, because people would disagree because of their local, orientation. And
because they feel they would lose their voice. Caledon would be a little p in the big, people would feel they're losing their voice. I'm sorry, this is my phone. Okay, I had turned off my other phone technology. So I don't at that time we did not consider the amalgamation of Peel the answer, but I will say about Hazel that she came out against our report. At that time there were 4 mayors that came out against it. She may have come out against it because she had her own priority being separation of Mississauga. And I think Hazel's views evolved over time. When Hazel was mayor in the early years, she promoted sprawl, and which I think was very unfortunate for Mississauga. Now, or even in the end of her term, she was then trying to do a lot of infill in the downtown area, and you and I met on that plaza, right? I think maybe her opinions were evolving. She was not a supporter of my report, and I think she was at that time headed in the wrong direction.
Well, she wasn't a supporter of two-tier, and so she wanted either Mississauga to be separate or bigger, but without she didn't like the idea of the regional government, someone else telling her what to do effectively.
And I could understand the objection to it. When I proposed the second tier, I did propose that the councillors serving on the second tier would be indirectly elected by the local tier, so that the local council would retain its control, if you will. And also the local council was having its own list of responsibilities expanded. In other words, the Metropolitan tier would primarily look after the broad issues around environmental, around infrastructure and land use planning, and economic, the marketing collaboration.
So in regards to Caledon, she did say that she thought the amalgamation of Mississauga-Brampton made a lot of sense, and then maybe Caledon should join a region north. And she used that example with York as well, that she thought, as Mayor Scarpitti for Markham recommended and got his hand slapped or wrist slapped by Premier Ford in the last election. You may know that Frank Scarpitti for Markham recommended the amalgamation of York, but maybe some of the more rural parts of York at the top, at the north end, join, some of the regions to the north of that. And to take it to the logical extension, you might have an amalgamation of Halton, Oakville and Burlington, maybe even Milton into a city, and Dufferin, Whitby, Ajax, Pickering into a city. And then you'd have 4 cities and the city of Toronto that could form a GTA council. Does that make any sense?
It could, but because our time frame was shortened from 1.5 years to 4 months, we did not deal with, and in fact, even within Toronto, we didn't get into looking at the 4 cities versus the 6 cities or versus a mega city. We dealt with property tax, which we did feel we did solve the problem. We dealt with development and the importance of compact development. We did a big study on the costs of sprawl. We dealt with the powers of local government. We dealt with what should be regional. And we dealt with how to improve economic competitiveness of the region. Did not get to the structure of governance outside.
You were part of a metropolitan mindset study in 2023, I understand, at the former Ryerson University, now Metropolitan University, that talked about the metropolitan mindset, and I understand that several different case studies were presented that really talked about cities that coordinate, work together, are more successful than cities that are fragmented. And I don't know what all the examples were that were used, but Denver had a great case study of not approving transit when it was all fragmented. They formed a major metropolitan council, and now transit has been developed, all coordinating with the airport all the way down to downtown. And that there were examples of other cities that stayed completely fragmented, Detroit being one, where you had white flight and money that left the downtown and starved the downtown of money. Based on some of the work that was done with that and your experience, is there a bright model?
I'm actually glad you asked that question. The answer is no. There is no single model that works for different cities. And I can say it with some authority, because when I left the conference board, I was invited to the Woodrow Wilson Institute for a little, I guess it was a little fellowship thing. And I chose my few months there to do a comparative study of transit systems. So I looked at the WMATA, which is the DC system. I looked at the MTA in New York. I compared it with what we had in Metrolinx, and I had already done some work on Montreal and Vancouver. Everybody has a different system. It does not matter what the system is. It matters what the goals and mindset is of the people who serve on that system. So what works in one area will not necessarily work in another. In BC, you have a different approach, but the province in BC controlled transit from the beginning. Transit was local in Ontario. So you just can't, the answer is, in my view, there is no single model that you can simply hope for will work. Can you learn from certain things? Yes. And we conducted, when I was at Ryerson, some workshops on that and brought people in from the Montreal who had their system, and then and again, it reinforced my conclusion that in this case, I love learning from different places, but you can't pick a model and apply it.
The opening sentence to your response was collaboration and coordination on a voluntary basis are hard to accomplish.
Yes, they are.
And you go on to talk about that you need to build trust. You need to have political arrangements. You need to have processes. You need to have a culture of engagement, collective problem solving. Do we have that in the Greater Toronto Area today?
So first of all, we don't have a single transit authority or a body with political accountability that manages our transit on a regional level. Before we go, I'd like to get to one point, which is that right now we have the province that acts as our regional government. And that point is that the province...
Hazel McCallion told me that the premier is the mayor of the Greater Toronto Area.
That's correct. And that the province has to be democratized. We have the province acting as our regional government, but we don't have the democratic foundation for that. But to go back to those points I made, one of the things we were doing at Metrolinx when I was on the board was creating a visionary plan for the future. You know, I can't remember the name of it now, but the staff and the board was intimately involved with trying to create a vision for Toronto 30 years out, for the GTA 30 years out. Prior to that, you'll recall that Kathleen had given a lot of money for transit, so-called 33 billion, which of course it's more, but to build transit out. And so we were trying to build that plan, and I watched as we tried to build in meetings with the local local planning staff. And the reason why it's hard is they're busy. They're working trying to satisfy, first of all, they have their own fires to put out in their own local municipalities. Not that they didn't cooperate, not that we didn't even meet with the chairman, say, of the York Transit group, but without some sort of political arrangement, some sort of obligation, people have other things on their plate, and they won't make it the priority that you want it to be. That's my experience also in dealing with people, that if all of your problem solving is just on a voluntary basis, it is when you get into groups like the Alliance for a Livable Ontario or other voluntary groups, but it takes an incredible amount of energy. At that same meeting that you mentioned, Don Iveson and Gabe Edelman were there, and they had presented this paper that we were responding to. And they reinforced the notion that I had written about 25 years ago, the need to create a metropolitan mindset. And they talked about the role of the mayor in reaching out constantly, not just to other political leaders in the area, suburban, around the city or whatever, but also to the education leaders, to the heads of universities, to the heads of big companies. If you've had a job where you're responsible for building consensus voluntarily with tons of people and tons of groups, you can understand how exhausting that is. I'm not saying it can't be done. And we have done it. There's examples in the past where we have done it, but it's hard to sustain. It's hard to sustain with some political arrangement and some process that people are part of and expect to be part of and acknowledge that they are part of it and feel obliged to participate.
So during the pandemic, my understanding is that there was a voluntary organization that met on a fairly frequent basis and was reasonably effective because it had to be because of the challenge of the pandemic. But the issue was it was 29 municipalities and the premier, and the 29 municipalities included 25 cities or towns, 4 regions, and the mayor of Toronto. And the comment was, the problem was when you've got towns that are 50,000 or 25,000, and the city of Toronto that is a couple million, and the premier, everyone listened to what Ford and Tory had to say, and not many other people had a voice. And so can you have a system where you've got this combination of very small cities and towns and the city of Toronto and the premier?
I had a bit of an experience with that because Premier Wynne had tried to set up a GTA mayor's didn't have a name, but it was like council, and it met, I think, at least 6 or 8 times. The reason I remember it is I chaired the meetings for the premier at that time, and we worked hard on creating an agenda, and we discussed issues. Sometimes the issues were a problem that the mayors had with the federal program that they weren't getting access to. Sometimes it had related to local provincial relationships, and work was done, but it was time limited. It was time limited, of course, because of the election. So there are efforts like that, and sometimes they can accomplish some things. But again, I guess my point is not that it can't happen, but sustaining those kind of efforts is tough.
Yeah, well, I understand it's sort of gone into abeyance since the the end of the pandemic. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments with Ann Golden, Toronto Region Metropolitan Urbanist, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to be chatting tonight with Ann Golden, who for, I don't know, 50, 60 years has been someone that has been studying and commentating on the Toronto region, and in 1996 chaired a task force on Toronto. I understand now that she was a chair for Premier Wynne of a GTA council. She spoke in 2023 at a big conference in regards to the future of Toronto. And just last week, you co-authored an article, a column in the Toronto Star in regards to your opposition to a bill in front of the Ontario legislature right now. And tell us what your opposition was, if you could.
Well, David and I addressed specifically what the changes would do in terms of promoting sprawl and what the impact would be on housing. So this is an omnibus bill with a lot in it, and the thrust of it is to change the Environmental Assessment Act. It's one of Ontario's oldest, most important environmental laws, and it really eliminates the requirement that all projects of all kind, but be they roads, be they waste disposal sites, that they all have to have an environmental assessment. But it also, in that bill, there's a little devious part of it. I think I consider it devious, because what they want to do is circumvent public participation on local decisions. And I think, as I've said all throughout this, I think local input is not always right, but it can be valuable and it's important. And I am worried that what this will do, we are worried, not I, we are all worried that it will basically promote sprawl, because it will make it easier and quicker to use these MZOs to approve developments that are not consistent with good planning, the kind of planning we need, and also to build the kind of housing we need now, because right now we are in a housing crisis affecting many parts of our population.
We had a mayoralty election in Toronto in the last year that really changed things from a more laissez-faire right-wing mayor to Olivia Chow. What do you think of that change to Toronto, and how do you think Olivia Chow is doing so far?
I think I have to give her very high marks. A couple of points. I think, first of all, she's set a really good tone for the city in terms of how she is working with senior officials. She set an immediate positive tone with the premier, probably obtained a better fiscal deal than many thought she could. She's addressing the key issues. I thought her handling of the budget exercise was great. She gave opportunity for some local input. I thought it was very clever, the way she managed public opinion, so that once the budget proposal went below 10% increase, everybody went, oh, okay, that's not too bad. And the truth is, we had to increase taxes, and she wasn't afraid to take that on. On a personal level, I think she did something so gracious and generous that I think people don't know about. Shortly after the election, she held an event that I attended to help Josh Matlow, her opponent, pay off his debt. And hundreds of people attended, and the entire campaign debt was paid off in one evening because she hosted it. And she was asked, why did she do this? Because he had been a political opponent. And it was kind of, her answer, in my view, was Lincoln-esque. She said, I want people to know that if they want to participate in public service, that people who love the city and who want to participate we welcome all of that. And then I noticed when she made her appointments, she included a number of her opponents on key committees. Again, someone that's an approach that is Lincoln-esque. That is, you know what I'm referring to as
Team of rivals.
He brought a team of rivals. Yeah. So I think she's setting a very good tone for Toronto, and I think she's doing great.
You probably won't answer this question, but let me ask you anyway. If you had a magic wand and you could make one big change that would impact the greater region, metropolitan Toronto, given this fact that we are now the fourth largest city in North America and going to be, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million people in the next couple of years in the greater Toronto area, what would you do with that magic wand? What change would you make?
The first thing is I would give cities, and somehow, I would do two things. I would give cities more sources of revenue. I have looked at all, studied over the years. We are, considering our size, third largest city, not in North America, and not counting Mexico. We are so under-resourced that it's just terrible. So I would give Toronto more money so that it could address the issues that are coming at it and that it's having to deal with. And I guess I would try to. I guess given where we are now, I would try to create greater accountability at the provincial level for decisions they're taking about the region and about Toronto.
Ann Golden, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you better and chatting with you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. I've enjoyed it and appreciate it. Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Florida, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are on after they are broadcast on the radio on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media and on YouTube. Thanks. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Ann, very much.